Welcome to the With You and For You podcast. Our desire is to equip college-age students within the Edmond, OKC area by discussing topics and questions that are relevant to our generation. With that in mind, let's get to the show.
Welcome back, guys, to the With You and For You podcast. It is your host, Tyson Hill. Not joined, as always, by four of my friends who will introduce themselves in a second. Today, we got a good one. We got a fun one for you. We are going to look at what it looks like to serve overseas on mission. And we've got some awesome college missionaries who went overseas this last summer with one link with us today. So to start off, why don't we introduce ourselves, say your name, what grade you're in, and what's your major?
Hi, my name is Anna Kelly. I am a senior right now at UCO, and I'm studying interpersonal communication.
Hey everyone, I'm Isaiah Rodham, and I'm a senior at UCO as well, and I'm studying accounting.
What's up? My name is Riley. I am a senior at UCO, and I'm studying sociology.
Hey guys, I'm Pedro Gremmel. I'm also a senior at UCO, and I'm studying international business.
Awesome. Thank you guys for hanging out with me on this early Saturday morning. First off, let's just start off with the logistics. So we had two different teams here. The boys went one place and you went one place. So if you would just start by saying, Anna and Isaiah, where you served and like what specific mission field you were in while you were there.
Yeah, so I went to Japan with two girls from OSU. We were a little tiny team. And we split up our time. I'd say about 50% of our time, we were just going to our local college campus and just meeting people, making friends, sharing the gospel, and just interacting a lot with college students. And then the other 50% of our time was split between like helping our missionary hosts and supporting them in whatever ways they needed, and like spending time with the local bodies of believers and helping them out with whatever they needed. And so, yeah.
So me and the boys and a guy from OSU, Randall, we went to Nairobi, Kenya. And while we were in Kenya, we actually had a very rigid schedule that we mostly never followed. So we spent Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays on campus at a local university called PAC, Pan-African University. Pan-African Christian University. There we go. And we were there prayer walking and just discipling, having a good time, making connections, making friends. And then we also had a day where we spent it at our local church. We partnered up with a church that was about 30 minutes away. And we did dry street evangelism. And we just had a good time. We also had a lot of fun doing stuff, hanging out with people. And on Saturdays, we ran a discipleship class with people we met through the week and just taught them the basics of being a Christian. So, yeah.
So oftentimes whenever people, they go on mission, there's a lot of like anxiety beforehand before they actually give God their yes. And so for y'all, was there any roadblocks leading up to your decision to actually go serve overseas? And if so, like how did you overcome those?
So there was a few roadblocks that I had about a couple weeks before the One Link signups opened up. I had went to Kyle and I was like, Kyle, I think I want to go spend my summer overseas and see what that looks like. And I thought I was going to be going to China with Riley, and then they closed their borders to Americans. And so we didn't go to China. And so after I'd put my yes on the table, I was really just nervous about getting in. And then there was the issue of my job. So I was employed for full-time at a bank, and I was like, I don't know how they're going to take me going overseas. And I had to quit my job, actually. I quit my job in May, and I went overseas. That was a really tough roadblock to overcome. A lot of nights just questioning whether I made the right decision, deciding to quit my job and go overseas for the summer.
Yeah, I had a few roadblocks as well for different reasons, but I think for me it was like a 2-year roadblock from the moment of like, okay, I know the Lord wants me overseas, and me giving my 100% full yes and being overseas. I think I made a lot of excuses. So like the first one is like I'm an international student, and so it was like, well, but I'm an international student. Can I get a visa? Being here in America with a visa, and I had to overcome that. And then also just like, which it might be relatable to everybody else, but like summer for a lot of people is like time where you work and make money, and we're all broke college students, and so it was like, oh, can I, be willing to do that? And I think just like surrendering everything to the Lord and being willing to put it all on the table, and not working or having to quit things or having to overcome that fear of like, okay, I'm an international student. How is that going to look like? And making those excuses. I'll say kind of like it was more like psychological roadblocks that I just had to be like, okay, Lord, I trust that you're calling me. And so I'm going to go.
So after you gave God your yes, was there anything that individually y'all did to kind of prepare to go overseas? Anything like resource materials you went through or like study guides you kind of did to kind of help you just get mentally prepared for doing this work?
Well, we all went through One Link, and they have a like training study. What is it that we went through? Yeah, like training material. Yeah, like we got assigned our locations and our teams in December right before Christmas, and then there was like a big giant Zoom meeting between all the One Link teams, I think early February or late January, and that was kind of like the first time that each team was supposed to meet as a group. And so I know my team, we met roughly every week. Sometimes we'd go a couple weeks in between, and just went through like the preparation material. And then there was like stuff during the week that we would all have to do. That was really cool. And like verses that we had to memorize. And so like there was a lot of preparation. And like that's one thing that One Link does so well is like prepare. With like all of that time, like through the whole semester before we left. And then there was like a week of training that we went to. And so that was, I think, what we did. I'm trying to think if I did anything else.
So Anna mentioned a training that we went to. It was called O Week. And during O Week, they simulated life in another country by putting us in scenarios with different smells, different experiences, a very well put together training. It pushed us. There was a lot of opportunities for us to grow. They used a really common analogy of like a water bottle, and what they did is they shook the water bottle up and they see what came out the top. And by the end of it, you saw yourself in your rawest form. There was a lot of frustration, a lot of crying. I cried a lot while I was there. But there was also a lot of growth. I think I grew in my walk as a Christian and also grew as a man. That training turned me into a man. I went in a boy, left a man. So it was very, very good training. And if you want to experience that, go on a One Link trip.
So adding to what Isaiah and Anna said, I think also there's the aspect of like just keep growing in holiness and godliness while you are here. And so not only through prayer and time in the Word, but just like I think a misconception is that a lot of people will go overseas and be like, okay, being overseas is going to make me a missionary and I'm going to be sharing the gospel and I'm going to be doing all these things. But the reality is like it's not going to be in a different country that's going to make you do all that. So just making sure that I was active and sharing the gospel and praying for people and discipling people while I was here, I think that was really crucial and definitely helped like preparing for when we were in that context. And so and through like the training that we had beforehand, like the materials that they had, they would give little like things of like, hey, who's somebody that you can try sharing a story about Jesus this week and things like that. But I think making sure you are like not only deeply abiding in the Lord while you're here, but also being obedient to what he asks of us and actively doing those things and not just waiting to get there for like a magical moment that's going to transform you. And so I think that's a really good way to prepare.
The thing I would say that I didn't do well at, that like I would just recommend to others is just to pray. Like just pray as much as you can about it. pray for your heart. Pray for open eyes to see the reality of what your actions are and what your teammates' actions are. Pray for your teammates, for each one of them, and just for their hearts to be prepared for what they're about to experience. Pray for the people that you're going to interact with while you're there, and while you're overseas, because you're going to be meeting so many people, and it's somewhat overwhelming at times. So, but if prayer makes a difference, and I wish I would have done more of it when I was here in country before I left. So I suggest that to anybody who's going to go overseas. Pray about it. Pray about it at all times, every single day, and just get into the Word and do those the things that are necessity to your faith, to prepare well for this.
So one of probably the biggest roadblocks for a lot of college students to get over is fundraising in order to go overseas, because it's not cheap to fly across the world for 8 to 9 weeks. And so for those people who are scared of the support raising aspect of it, what advice would y'all give to them?
Like, just don't forget that all the money is the Lord's. Like, even the money that is not being spent on missions, like everything is the Lord's. And so, like, it's not ours to keep. It's not other people's money to keep. Like, if the Lord really does want you in another country serving him, he's going to provide, because it's not money that the Lord is giving to you. It's like the Lord is just using you in going overseas. It's a roller coaster. Like, it is such an emotional roller coaster. I remember there would be weeks that, because we were fundraising for a whole semester, there would be weeks that I'd be doing great. And then other weeks I would look at it and be like, oh my gosh, I am so worried. Towards the end, I was going to Kyle's office almost every week and being like, hey, Kyle, how's it looking? And he's like, it's going to be okay, Anna. I'm like, okay. And so just trust the Lord. That's the main advice I have.
Kind of adding to trust in the Lord. So for me, fundraising was a little scary. My parents are both educators, and so like my parents weren't able to give any money towards my trip, but my parents did pray. And every time I felt like nervous about it, I went to my parents and I was like, Mom, Dad, I don't know what I'm going to do. I said yes to this. I've already told my job I'm quitting in May, and so I can't go back on it. And so I want to do this. And what my dad said was, Isaiah, if God wants you to go, he's going to provide the money. It doesn't matter what that looks like. We had to raise $5,000. $5,000 is a penny to God, less than a penny. He has so much more than that in heaven. He'll provide it. And 2 weeks later, I'm at work, and I have a new client come in, and we start talking, and he sees me wearing a cross. He's like, oh, are you a Christian? I was like, yeah. We start talking about that, and he tells me he's retiring from his job, and he wants to start a missions organization, fully supporting people overseas. And I was like, well, I'm also going on mission. He was like, oh, how much do you have? And I was like, oh, it's a lot. And he was like, what's the number? And I was like, what? And he said, whatever you don't have, I'll provide. And I remember crying because, like, God provided some stranger to come in and pay for over half my trip. And that doesn't happen if God didn't want me to go. So trust in the Lord and know that if he's called you to go, you're going to go regardless of what happens.
Yeah, that's really good. And I think even on a like more practical way, just get creative with it. Like with whatever organization you're going, you'll probably send out letters to people. And with that, like send to everybody that you know. Like literally I sent so many letters, and some people that I was not expecting like anything. I was just like, man, I just want you to pray for me. They were so generous. And even with like friends, like I have a bunch of friends that are in college, and I was like, I don't want to put a burden on them and things like that. But even them, like they were so generous. But like get creative, do like garage sales. I know Anna and I, we embroider on shirts and sold them. Like find your talent. If you can do a worship night, do it, or like whatever it is, photo shoots. Get creative with the talents and gifts that God has given you, and just like use it to like support Raise. I think that's a good idea too. And just trusting the Lord big time.
Just real quick to add to the end of that, like, if you're going into it, like, expecting people to give you money, like, maybe just change your mindset. Like, you're just asking people to support your trip, like Pedro was saying, through prayer. Like, prayer is the most important. And so, like, first ask for prayer, first ask for people to just, like, be willing to support you in that. And then if the Lord puts it on their heart to give you money, like, they'll do that. But just, like, change your expectations.
We've got different amounts of travel experience up here whenever we go to like this overseas mission. We have Pedro, who is from Brazil, has been around the world, back and forth from Brazil several times. And we have Isaiah, who flew on his first plane to Kenya this summer. And so leading up to it, even with the money to be raised and classes to be done and like all of this that's happening, there's probably different levels of anxiety that kind of happen the closer and closer we get to it. And so I really want to know, like, what type of pre-trip anxieties did y'all have, and like how did you like kind of deal with those?
I don't think I struggled a whole lot with pre-trip anxieties until like days before we left. Like, I was doing fine. I was cruising. Like, anytime anyone would ask me, I'm like, I'm so excited. It's going to be so great. And then a couple of days before, I think partially it just hit me that Pedro and I were about to be apart for like 7 to 8 weeks. And all those anxieties came. I was like, oh my gosh, like, that's a long time. Like, we're not even going to be able to communicate at all while we're going to be gone. And so I definitely called him almost crying a couple days before he left. Like, I'm actually really like, what is about to happen? And so those emotions hit me pretty hard. And once again, just like giving everything to the Lord and like trusting the Lord. Like, I can't stress how much, like, through this whole process from like very beginning to like the final days, it's just like putting all my trust in the Lord was so necessary. But I was able to just, instead of like, even though I was emotional and like had a lot of anxiety about being apart for that long, I was able to like take those emotions to the Lord before I took them to him. And just really like rely on the Lord in prayer, go to scriptures. One verse that I found and like really like clung to then and then also through the whole trip is in Psalms 4. And it says, like, for you have put more joy in my heart than they have when their grain and wine abound. And I was able to just recognize, once again, before and through the whole trip, like, this is a time in our relationship when, like, it's really hard and we're not communicating and it's really sad and there's all these anxieties that are coming from that. And, like, it is not a season in my life where, like, my grain and wine are abounding. But the Lord is still with me, and so, like, the Lord has put more joy in my heart than other people have in those seasons. And so I was able to just, like, find my joy in the Lord. So that's probably most of the anxieties that came.
One thing I did that I don't suggest is push all your anxieties down, because I did that. And I felt a lot of anxious thoughts and anxious feelings towards the trip, but I didn't choose to feel those things because I didn't want to go through that and process that. And they all kind of came out when I got to Kenya. So I don't suggest that. So if you are feeling anxious about the trip, and if you are considering going on a trip and feeling anxious about it, feel those things, talk to people about them, and like understand that it's okay. Like, and those anxious thoughts and feelings are gonna be somewhat natural because you're doing something that you've never done before. You're going maybe halfway across the world, and there's some anxiety that's going to come along with that. Just being honest, you cannot just push that down though, because that's what I did, and it will all come out at once if you do that overseas. So if you are feeling anxious about these things, find somebody you trust, find somebody that you love, express those things, and and don't say no because of them. That's the biggest thing. Don't say no because of the anxieties and fears that you have, because the Lord is our comforter, and He is our peace, and you can go to Him in any times of trouble. So just go to Him and go to the people that you love and that you know love and care for you, and just try to do your best.
And I think too, like, I remember for me, there would be times where I would be very anxious and like really worried about everything that's going on, and weeks that I'm chilling. And then weeks that I'm really, really focused on, I need to finish this semester. And then weeks that I'm like, oh no, I need to be focused on the mission. I need to be focused on the summer. And I think just through it all, kind of like just echoing everything that you guys said. Just like, okay, it is okay to be anxious. It is not okay to not trust with the Lord with your anxieties.
So this next question, I really want to take y'all back. You just flew around the world. For Anna, you just landed in Japan. For y'all, you just landed in Kenya. And your feet finally hit the ground in your mission field that you're going to serve for 8 weeks. What was going through y'all's minds when you're there for the first time and you're in it now?
I was so tired and so hungry. Like, we got in at like 10 p.m. and we were exhausted. And so that was like the first thought. But then the next morning we were walking around and everything was so new and like so overwhelming and so exciting. And I think like the first several days were really, really hard. And I can get more into that later. And I think like at first I thought I was doing a lot better than I was. I was like, oh, I'm doing great. And then like a weekend I was like, oh, I wasn't doing great. But yeah, everything was just so exciting. I remember especially like the first morning we were walking around and it was like 8 a.m. We were going to meet our missionary hosts. And we're seeing all these like kindergarten age, like preschool kids walking around by themselves in the city of 1.5 million people. And that was like this huge shock to us. We were like, these children are not supervised by their parents. And we got to our host house and we were like, why are these like kindergartners walking around by themselves? And they're like, oh yeah, that's just normal here because Japan is incredibly safe. And so like there was like some of that immediate culture shock that we were like, what? Like never in a big city in America would you see children like this, like walking around by themselves. But it was super normal in Japan. And so it was just like this huge collection of like excitement and like expectations and like we don't know what to expect and uneasiness, like all these things coming together. And so it was a fun time.
For me, we had just landed and we had a great experience actually. Our flight was good. We had this amazing pastry thing. I don't know what it was, but it was a gift from God. And we land and we get out of the plane and we're walking across this tarmac to our bus that we're going to take over to our terminal to pick up our stuff. And I walk inside the building, and the first thing that hits me is, this smells weird. It didn't smell like the U.S. Before we had flown from OKC to Chicago, then Chicago to London, and then London to Nairobi, and like everywhere else smelled like, well, us. And then we land in Kenya, and it's just new smells, new experiences. And I'm just looking around, and I'm like, okay, this doesn't look like any airport I've been in before. And then we get our stuff, and I remember walking out and seeing our hosts, and then walking to their car. I do remember there were a couple guys trying to take our luggage and push it for us because they were going to charge us afterwards or keep our luggage. And before like we start rolling our luggage, and this guy's like, "Let me help you," and we're like, "Okay." And then it finally took our host saying, "Stop," and he was like, "My bad." And so we get to the car, and I think the craziest thing I saw was he did something with his phone to like pay, because not anyone uses debit cards while we're in Kenya. They use things called M-Pesa. It's a payment app, and he had it like on his phone. And when I say on his phone, I mean he went to his settings, he clicked 2 buttons, and like some screen popped up that I've never seen on an iPhone. And I was like, whoa! Paid for his parking, and I remember driving because where we were at was like 30 to 45 minutes away from the airport where we were staying at. And just, I felt like a toddler in the big city a toddler who had lived in the country and was driving to the big city for the first time. Because like, I was like, whoa, it is so cool. All the buildings are here. And it was just a new experience. And then we get to our place, have a interesting time during check-in where I didn't have electricity. And then I went to bed, woke up, took a freezing cold shower, and then we went and met our hosts. And they'll elaborate more on the first few days later on.
I was honestly just like really excited to be there, really tired. We've been flying for more than one day at that point. Yeah, it was like 10, 11 p.m. and we're carrying our luggage, and our host is already telling us like a few informations about like what we're doing the next day. It was just like, what's going on? And then just being a bit nervous too, just like, okay, what is about to go down here? Like, excited to see the culture and the ministry, but then just like that first immediate reaction of like, oh, this is different. We look different, we act different. People are looking at us like, oh, things are about to go a bit different while we're here. And so, just exhausted.
For Anna and Riley, just kind of walk me through those first couple of weeks in country, just your days, your weeks, anything that you think eventful to talk about.
Yeah. The first, I'd say, like 10 days was for our team easily like the hardest part of the trip. Because we got there, I mean, first of all, Japan is 14 hours ahead. It's a very drastic time change. And so no matter how hard you try when you're traveling, like jet lag is just awful. And so like we were super jet lagged and just getting onto a new schedule. We were in this completely new cultural context. I mean, like you're walking around, it's a big city. All the signs, all the street signs are in like business signs are not only in a language that you don't understand, but like in 3 different alphabets that are not even remotely similar to what you're used to. And for me, actually, I had like worked super hard to learn one of the alphabets. And so I knew it pretty well, but I was working so hard to try to like sound out the letters that I was exhausting myself. And just like Pedro had told me this before we even like left, that like the first 2 weeks you're existing in a new country, just existing is so exhausting. And so we were dealing with a lot of that, of just like exhaustion from just like being alive, basically. And we were trying to figure out like, how are we going to do money? How are we going to navigate? Those are the things that like caused some of the things that caused the most conflict in our team, because it was like, oh, we have to get from point A to point B. And when you're in a setting like in America, in a city that you're used to, that's like something that you take for granted. But when you place yourself in an uncomfortable setting where you can't even read the street sign, like that is one of the hardest things to do, getting from point A to point B. And so we were just dealing with like all that exhaustion. But then also we were still trying to figure out what the ministry was going to look like that we were going to be doing. And so we had all these like either expectations that we had for the trip that we didn't realize that we had. And then by the time we were there on the ground and like ended a day and we were all really frustrated, we were like, oh, I guess this was an expectation that I had. And so first 2 weeks was really hard. Lots of like tension between us as a team. We basically like every evening when we got home, we would have to like sit down for at least 30 minutes and be like, what happened today? Like this thing happened and that frustrated me, or like you said this thing and it really hurt me. And so we had to like work through a lot of like emotions with each other. That down the road really helped us, because at the first part of the trip, we were like in conflict and hurting each other without knowing it, because that's what happens when you work with people. And we would have to like bring to each other like, hey, this happened and that really hurt me. But then by the end of the trip, it was really cool because we were able to recognize, oh, I said this thing and I know that it probably hurt Madeline in this way. And so I was able to go to her and be like, hey, I'm really sorry that I did this. I'm sorry that I hurt you. And so we put a lot of work in on the front end that like really paid off towards the end. But just like tension was not fun. Tension is hard. And so by the end of like the first week or so, the first week to 2 weeks, there was this huge turn, and so very hard. That's why I tried, like, if people are going to ask me questions about, like, going on mission trips, I would advise, like, don't do shorter than 6 weeks, like, if possible, because, you know, especially if you're going all the way to the other side of the world, like, the first 2 weeks is just a lot of tension, conflict, jet lag, all the things. And so that's my thoughts.
So the first couple weeks of being in Kenya was different. It was, like Anna said, jet lag is a real thing. I remember the first whole week that we were there, we were all exhausted, like the entire time. And I remember like all of us were waking up just at 3 a.m. like every night for I think about 5 days. 3 a.m. would be the time we all would wake up. And so like that's completely real. And it's just going to happen. You kind of just got to get through that part. Going to church that first Sunday, I think was one of the roughest experiences for us. Well, Kenyan church lasts very long, so it was 6 hours, 6 hours long, and so we get there and everything, and we're all just exhausted, and we've only been in country for 2 days at the time, and I look over at Pedro and he's kind of fading, and I kind of hit him, and then at one point, this is in middle service, I'm doing the same thing, and he hits me, and he looks at me and is like, dude, pinch your arm, it helps, pinch your arm, it'll keep you awake. And I was like, okay, all right. So we were just trying our best, and that's just gonna happen. You're gonna be tired, and it's gonna be exhausting in the first at least a week anyway. But prepare for the culture shock of it too. Being especially we all look somewhat white, and and so especially like going to Africa and Kenya, we stuck out like a sore thumb. Getting used to that was pretty difficult. Being especially like for me, I didn't think it was going to be difficult, but being around the city and just walking around the city, and everywhere we go, just being called a Mzungu, which is white person in Swahili, essentially, yeah. Being called a Mzungu, like being videoed on our phones, like just people coming up to us asking, like, "Oh, I've never seen a white person before. You're the first ever white person that I've ever seen." Yeah, that's a whole nother story. So like getting through that was not easy either. But then yeah, that was an experience in itself. And then getting into like the routine and schedule of things in another country is like, Pedro, you can kind of attest to this, but like it's so difficult because it's completely flipped up from like what you do at home, and you're having to do ministry at the same time, and like just working on both sides of your brain with that is exhausting, and you're coming home, and at least for the first couple weeks, exhausted every single night. And that's just the reality of it, is that it is tiring the first couple weeks. It gets better. I will tell you that it gets better as far as like just learning the routine, learning how to do things in another country, learning some of the language. Yeah, working as a team, it gets a little bit easier working with others. And something we didn't expect also is other missionaries to be there too. That was a big thing for us, and caught us like completely by surprise. And that took a lot of adjusting because we thought we were going to be the only guys over there. And then we come there, and there's 20 plus other Americans, 25 other Americans that are working alongside us. And and that was a learning curve in itself. So a lot of things just kind of are thrown at you over there, overseas, but you got to be flexible enough to understand that we have to take those things and not let them crumble us, but to take those things and take them and run with stride, because that's what you have to do, and you only have 8 weeks to do it, so you have to just take it and run with it.
So one thing I do want to kind of follow up on is something that you were talking about, Anna, about conflict and stuff like that. And so I really want to talk about how, like, yeah, sometimes things don't go the way you think they're going to go while you're overseas, and not only with just conflict, but I know with Pedro and Isaiah, y'all fought being sick for a little bit. I know, Pedro, you were down for like a week or two. And so I'll ask this specifically to Anna and Pedro to answer this, but like, how did y'all deal with things when they didn't go the way you thought they would? And if you dealt with them negatively, how do you think you should do it better in the future?
I think I didn't realize how many expectations I was walking into the trip with. And like after the first couple of days, as we were talking about with the team, that's one thing we identified as just causing tension within our team and like even within ourselves was like, oh, I guess I just had this expectation and it isn't being met right now. And that's harder than I anticipated it being. And so just if you are going overseas, just know that you have expectations you don't realize you have. And that's okay for it to be different when you get there. And just know, and this is one thing they talked about so much at training that I didn't realize, like, I'm a communications major. I have literally taken a college level course in conflict. I still didn't realize like how serious like conflict and how like hard it would be on our team. And I'm really thankful for the girls. Like, even though we did go through it, we had such a commitment to communicate and like work through it. But like when you're in America as a college student, like maybe I have roommates, but I'm used to being pretty self-sufficient. Like I think we all, when we do ministry here in Oklahoma, it's like, okay, like I'm self-sufficient. I'm able to do things on my own. But in Japan, the three of us were together literally 24 hours a day, 7 days a week with like, and I'm not exaggerating, like once a week, there was probably at most a 3 hour to 5 hour period when the three of us weren't together. And we like woke up in the same room. We had like a 1-room apartment. We ate together. We like walked to our first place together. We spent the whole day together. We went home together. Like if we had a rough day and there was tension and we weren't addressing it, like it was going to be really awkward because we were all just sitting in the same room. And so that's why I said, like at the beginning, we would sit down every night and be like, this is what's hurting me. This is what's frustrating me. This is how you offended me. And once we brought that to light, we were able to be like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize that was hurtful. I'm so sorry. And so conflict happens. It's not a negative thing. It can become a negative thing if it's not dealt with well. But just go in knowing that it's going to happen, and just communicate about it. Apologize. Get so good at apologizing. Get so good at forgiving. And like the Lord is going to work through you guys, but like it's going to be a lot easier to work with each other if you can like just like humble yourself before each other literally every second of every day.
Yeah, that's really good, and I can talk a little bit about what to do and what not to do, because I feel like we did a lot of things that we would probably all done differently. And if I say something you guys disagree, please jump on in. But I think like Anna emphasized how they really, really communicated in the first few weeks. I think for us, we had this like preconceived idea, like, man, we're doing great. We just came from like a really bonding week right before like leaving the country. We're killing it. We have all these expectations, these preconceived ideas. It's going to be fine. And so we get there, and the first like 2 to 3 weeks are pretty brutal, like on our bodies. Like we're fighting smells, fighting jet lag. Some of us are getting sick. I think all three of us got sick at some point. And then on top of all of that, you're starting to realize like, yeah, these are like my really, really good friends that I deeply, deeply love, but I'm spending so much time with them. Like an extreme amount of time that you have never spent even with like your family, right? Or, so like with your family, for example, you wake up, you're with them, but then you go to school or you go to work or stuff like that, or roommates and stuff. And here, like Anna said, you're together all the time. And so I think for us, those first few weeks, we started realizing that. But I know for me, I was like, oh, we're probably just really tired. We just need rest. And one of the things that I feel like we ended up putting in the back burner was like communicating and talking and coming together in prayer. And so like when it comes to like conflict, it's going to happen. Like just know it's going to happen. Now, it doesn't have to be a bad thing. Like it can be a very redeeming, beautiful thing that the Lord uses to bond the team more. But if not dealt with it correctly, if things are not brought to light. And I think one thing that we all did really poorly was like we kept to ourselves and bottled those feelings. And then whenever they came out, they were just already like exploding. And we had to do a lot of like, okay, we're going to have to do a lot of like conflict resolution after the fact that you already explode things and things are already out of control and chaos. And so I would highly advise to having, like, even though you may be tired, even though there may be things that are going to put aside, like, don't neglect to come together in prayer. Don't neglect to come together and talk about your feelings. Don't give time to process, but don't communicate about it. I think one thing that I know I dealt with very poorly is, like, I would ask people how they were, but then I would perceive that there was something wrong, and I would just kind of, if they were like, "Yo, I'm doing fine," I'd be like, "Okay, they're cool then," and I would just, all right, that box is checked. Let's move on to the next thing. While in my, like, heart, I knew, like, there's probably something more in here that we need to talk, but I would neglect those things. And so don't do that. Don't do it. Don't do it. Don't do it. And
So something that we did not do well, that, like, kind of Pedro already mentioned, is just communication in general. But something that Tyson actually said to me, I think it was yesterday, is that we have to be willing to put aside our feelings to pursue what is true, and pursue the truth of what the gospel says and what the Bible says that we should do in these situations. Because if like, we're being honest, like, we didn't do that very often. Like, there was not much conflict resolution with that kind of stuff, and we let our feelings get in the way of what is true and what we should have done. So, like, no matter what you're feeling, just look back to the Word and see what that says about these things and about this conflict resolution. Because if we're being honest, like, we would 100% went back and done those things. That would have made the trip so much better and so much easier. And that would have saved us a lot of hurt and a lot of time. So that's something I recommend to everybody, is that we have to put aside our feelings to pursue what is true. And that's just the reality of it.
Thank you guys for talking about that. I think it's very important to highlight the fact that, like, when people come together on mission for a long time, that, like, there are things that the Lord will teach you. There are things that the Lord will show you about yourselves and your teammates that you need to learn. And so I think it's beautiful that he gives us these opportunities to work on it while we're there, look at it post-trip, and work on it when we get home. And so it really is just a cool opportunity to see, like, oh, yes, Lord, you're right. I forgot that, like, this is important to you, and it should be important to us as well. So I appreciate y'all for being open about that. Moving on, so whenever we look at your trip, 8 weeks, that's a long time to be somewhere. It's a long time to be in one place. And so at times, y'all probably had to fight being complacent, because by the end of 8 weeks, in the middle of 8 weeks, like, you're kind of in the groove of things, and so it's very easy just to make it normal again. And so how did y'all fight the urge to be complacent during this time overseas?
I don't think complacency is what our team actually struggled with. I think because we knew we were there for such a short period of time. We were like, okay, we're only here in the country for 6 weeks. We only have, like, this amount of time, and so we are going to, like, run the race as, like, well and as hard as we can. And I think we really struggled with, like, giving ourselves permission to rest. Like, One Link really stresses, the sending organization that we went through really stresses Sabbathing. And so we had a 1 day a week where we Sabbathed. But, like, during the day when we weren't on our Sabbath, we would be, like, really exhausted or just not have plans and be like, can we actually, like, sit down at this coffee shop for an hour and read our books? Like, is that allowed, or do we have to be doing stuff? And so the first couple weeks, we really struggled with that. And then by the time about halfway through, we're like, okay, no, it's important to rest. It's okay to rest. Like, we can give ourselves that time as long as we're doing it well. And so I'd say that was actually more of our struggle than fighting complacency.
I know for our team, we struggle with complacency a little bit, but for the most part, we believed in our schedule. We followed our schedule to the best of our abilities, and we were pretty busy. And our host really stressed to us, like, hey, being a missionary overseas is not 24/7. I'm always meeting with someone. I'm always doing something. It's more like an 8 to 5. And like we woke up, we had breakfast together, and then we went to our ministry area and we did ministry for the day. And I think at most we spent in the ministry area was about 5-6 hours, maybe a little more than that, maybe a little less. But we were okay with it. I know for me, I knew, okay, God, I can't fully serve you if I'm exhausted from doing too much. And I know that the introverts on the team need time away from people. It was those two. Me and Randall were ready to go 24/7. We would have been okay with it. But for Pedro and Riley, they needed rest. Like for them, they need time away from people to recharge. Is how they recharge their batteries. And so like time spent at where we were staying at, just in solitude, our quiet time together, that like really helped us fight like the complacency urge. But there was some moments that like we as a team were like, man, I wish we were doing more. Like when our ministry day got canceled, or when someone didn't show up to get coffee, which happened quite a few times. And so that's really what I felt while I was there with complacency.
So really, I just want to spend some time sharing stories from your trip. So funniest stories, success stories, failures, just take a turn sharing a story about your time overseas.
Okay, so we had some really great opportunities to actually have Bible studies with several of our friends. We would meet them. We met them early on. We just started having conversations, making friendships with them. We were very open. Obviously, we were there to share the gospel with them, and so we were just very open about our faith. And we just invited them to get into the Word with us, and they were really, really willing and excited to do that. And so we kind of did like a discovery Bible study method where we really wanted to take them like from creation through Christ and kind of show them the overarching story of the Bible and what God's like whole design was with the Bible. So we started in Genesis, and the whole point of a discovery Bible study method is just, instead of me going to the person that I'm trying to share the gospel with and saying like, this is what I believe, this is what the Bible is saying, this is what God did, this is what he said, just giving them the opportunity to read it and understand it for themselves and come to realizations. And so it wasn't like one moment that was like, this was like the coolest moment. It was just like this whole overarching, like the Lord working through so many different things. And just hearing like the people that we were trying to share the gospel with come to these realizations. Like I remember we were studying through Genesis 1 when God created the world, and we were talking to a really dear friend of ours. And we asked her like what that story told her about God. And she was like, well, God is really incredible. Like he was able to create the whole universe with his voice. And we were like, yeah, he is incredible. You're right. And so just hearing them see the beauty of the gospel for themselves. And by the end of the trip, like we had shared the gospel like every day with so many friends of ours who we had gotten really close to over the trip. And we didn't see any of them come to know Jesus. But that wasn't a failure on our part, a failure on anyone's part. Like we just got to see the Lord move, and that's enough to be so grateful for. Like if I went to Japan with this expectation that God was going to use me in all these powerful ways and that I was going to see all these people come to Christ, like that's actually putting more expectation on my ability to do something rather than what like God's plan is. And so going there and realizing God has been moving in Japan since like before he laid the foundation of the earth. When Jesus Christ died on the cross, he died with the people in Japan in mind. And it's not me who's doing anything. The Lord is just using me as this little tiny piece and his whole plan for the people of Japan. And just getting to see like people put pieces together. And then the same friend who said that one thing at the beginning of the trip about Genesis 1, at the end of the trip, we were trying to make connections between our friends who weren't believers and our friends who were. And we met the two of them. We always met with her and another girl. And we met with the two of them at a restaurant with a Korean college-age girl who was basically a missionary in Japan. And she was fluent in Japanese. She probably wouldn't say she was, but she was very proficient in the language. And before we were eating, we were like, okay, we like to pray. And the girls knew that at that point, and they were like ready to pray with us. And then our Korean friend was like, actually, can I pray? And we're like, yeah, of course, go for it. And so she started to pray in Japanese. And I saw our friends' like faces light up. And after the prayer, I turned to my friend and I was like, was that the first time you've heard someone pray in Japanese? And she was like, yeah. And so just being able to like see not only the Lord working in her heart, but just see her experience like someone speaking to God for the first time in her language. And then all of our interactions with her were in English, her second language, but our Korean missionary friend was able to share the gospel with the two of them for the first time in Japanese. And so like that was just so beautiful, seeing the Lord not work through us at all, but work through the girl in front of us and her interacting with them in their first language, and them being able to realize that God is not just the God of English. He's not just the God of America, because that's a perception that they have, but that God is a God for them, and he speaks Japanese, and he knows their names, and that he created them. And so that was definitely the coolest part, was just finishing a day and being like, God is so cool. How did he do that? That's wild.
So I will talk about my time and share my stories with a high, a low, and a buffalo. So high story is going to be a really good moment that I had. A low moment, well, obviously a low moment. And the buffalo is going to be a funny time that we had while we were in Kenya. Starting off with the high, it was about week 5, and Pedro and I were asked to lead worship for a meeting they were having. They were announcing the new city team leaders, and all the missionaries from the country were going to be coming to this one area and meeting and just having a good time, conversating, sharing stories, and announcing these new leaders. And they had asked Pedro and I to lead worship, and it was the day of. We went to a coffee shop, had some alone time, and then afterwards, Pedro and we went out to this courtyard area where Pedro's playing the guitar and I was singing. And we start practicing our set that we're going to do. And little did we know, it was a Muslim holiday. And suddenly we're surrounded by kids, Muslim kids. And their parents are out and everything. And, they're in their full garb for this holiday. And Pedro and I were like, okay, let's do this. Like, we went through, we started worshiping. And I remember we had just started singing In Christ Alone, which lays out the gospel very clearly. And these kids get their phones out and they start recording us. They're making fun of us, but they're recording us. Like one of them is treating their phone like a mic and singing and waving and doing all this. And it's funny because like we keep singing, we start singing louder, and then they stop making fun of us and they're just recording. And they're just listening to us sing. And they're listening to us praise the Lord and share the gospel through that. And then the crazy thing happened. They started showing their friends the video. So we didn't know it, but me and Pedro were sharing the gospel through these kids to other Muslims. These kids were becoming missionaries without even knowing it. It was one of the coolest experiences that I had, and I talk about it frequently because it was so awesome. A low moment, man, I realized that spiritual warfare is real. I had, growing up in church, my dad being a pastor, spiritual warfare, we're always talking about it. Hey, spiritual warfare is there. Hey, the enemy's fighting. Hey, it's a battlefield around you, everything you're going through. But I didn't truly experience it until we were in Kenya. It was about week 4, week 5. And, we had heard stories from the other missionaries that were there, the other teams, sorry. The other teams that were there about, some of the stuff they had experienced. One of them said they had actually came face with a demon. He woke up and a demon was standing over him. His team spent a few hours praying over his room, and he couldn't go back to sleep, and he was struggling. And we heard that consistently through all the teams. And then it gets to us, and I was like, well, I don't think we'd experienced anything like that. And I go to bed, and I'm laying in bed, and I suddenly just can't sleep. And then a light starts flickering, a light that shouldn't be flickering starts flickering, and I suddenly feel like something touching my hands. And I didn't realize it at the time, but it was spiritual warfare. The enemy was playing with my mind. And I finally was able to go to sleep, and I had this vivid nightmare of everyone dying, actually. It was very morbid. Riley got his arm cut off. Pedro lost his head. It was very, very, very morbid stuff. I wake up crying, and I'm not able to go back to sleep. And I was like, okay, it might have just been a one-night thing. And then every night for 2.5 weeks, I slept about an hour and a half, 2 hours. So I'm exhausted. My body's hurting. We're dealing with Kenyan food hurting our stomachs. And then on top of that, I can't sleep. And it was rough. That was probably my worst moment of the trip, was not being able to sleep. Our host had given us sleepy time tea. And every night Riley would stay up with me, and we would drink tea with some honey, and we would just talk. And I got really close with Riley during that time. So the Lord used it. Praise God that he was able to do that. But it was rough. So spiritual warfare is real, ladies and gentlemen. And if you don't think you're going to experience it, think again. It may not be to the extreme that I faced, but it's still going to happen. So my buffalo that I want to share, it was like 3 days before we were supposed to leave the first time. We had a flight malfunction, so we spent an extra weekend while there, but it was before that. So it was about Wednesday, our last Wednesday there. Our pastor texted us. And some context, his name is Pastor Francis, but everyone calls him the Pope. So if you hear me say the Pope, that's what I'm talking about, not the Pope in the Vatican, Pope Francis. So the Pope calls us, and he was like, I want y'all to have dinner in my home because you guys have been here this whole time, and I've never made a meal for y'all. And, you know, Africans, that's how they show their love, is by making you food. And so we're like, absolutely, let's go. And so we start walking, and just seeing the city as we were walking to his apartment, it was a little heartbreaking. Cause like we had been in like pretty civilized areas, like pretty like well-developed areas, and walking over to his apartment where he was, we had to walk past all these goats. And there was like spray painted pictures and like paintings of previous dictators. It was kind of funny. And then we had to walk through this like pile of trash and sewage just to get to his apartment. And as we're walking up, I remember like thinking, okay, this is what everyone thinks of when they think of a life in Africa. Run down apartment buildings, trash all over the place, a random horse walking by, goats everywhere, people trying to sell stuff. And we get to his apartment, and I don't know what I was expecting, but I was not expecting a 400 square foot studio apartment. I don't know why, but that's not what I was expecting. And we get in, and it was the four of us, the pastor and one of the deacons. His name was Isaac. And Isaac was like, Papa. And we said, wait a minute. Why are you calling him Papa? And we learned that that's what you call the pastor. You know how people say father here, they say Papa. So he was Papa Pope. And while we were, he says, okay, let's get the food out. So he gets this food out, and he pulls out this giant pot full of rice. And we're like, okay. And then he pulls out another even bigger pot of what he called, it's called pumpkin curry. And before I go any farther, there's no taste of curry. Straight pumpkin. They think salt is spicy. And so they don't season very well. So the curry was not very prevalent. It was good. It was essentially like a stew. And the pastor said, we can't leave until we all eat all of it. And so what I would describe as a food crawl. I had about 3 to 5 plates of this pumpkin curry and rice. Total weight, I'd say it was about 14 pounds of food. Randall had about 3 to 5 plates. Riley had 1. It was funny. We were eating, and the pastor looks over, and Riley went by Keith because our sounds are hard. And he looks over and he goes, Keith, eat more. Keith, why are you not eating? Keith, pull your weight. And Isaac, who was, I'd say he was in his 60s, 70s, he said, Papa, I'm eating more than Keith. And we lost it. And then we get done eating, and I remember laying down next to his bed on the ground and just thinking, I might die because I've eaten so much food. And there was no air conditioning, and he had one little window, and it was closed. And so while we were eating, we were all just like sweating, eating pumpkin curry and rice, and just being miserable. But that was it was a good memory. It was funny. Riley got absolutely roasted the entire time for not eating as much as he thought he would. And it was a really good experience. I loved going to his home. So yeah.
Go back.
Okay. So the story that I kind of have is a mixture of the whole trip. So we did this thing called Uber ministry all throughout the trip, and that's something that just kind of started day one. Like we rode in an Uber with one of the M's that were over there, and he just started sharing the gospel with the Uber driver, and we're just like, oh, that's cool, I like that. And then we just started. We just started doing it. So like the very next like Uber we got into, we did that. And one specific time I remember, it was terrifying. We were in an Uber, and Randall, I love that guy. He's a guy that came with us from OSU. He started sharing the gospel with our Uber driver, and turns out he's a Christian. So it was pretty cool. Got a cool connection between there. But Randall brings out his phone and starts showing him like Bible verses on his phone. And the Uber driver's like leaning over at his phone, like while he's driving, looking at his phone and the Bible verses. And all of a sudden, this Uber driver just whips out a whole Bible and puts it in front of him while he's driving, like on the steering wheel, and like he's reading it as he's driving, and we're back in the back seat, kind of freaking out just a little bit. Thinking we're going to die on a Kenyan road because we're like, Randall's sharing the gospel with this guy. What do we do? Do we stop this? Is this safe? My parents don't need to know about this. And so, yeah, that was like that was an amazing moment to where it's like it was just a connection of like just two Christians coming together, even though it was somewhat dangerous. Uber Ministries, we saw so much fruit from that and saw the Lord just work through us sharing the gospel with our Uber drivers. And that's we easily shared the gospel over 100 times just in the times that we've like just rode with our Uber drivers, and every time that we were in one. And that's something that like I'll always just like look back towards, like that was awesome. That was so cool. And that's probably one of my fondest memories from that trip, is just every time that we did that was just so encouraging. And there was one specific moment that I will probably always remember, is we sang Goodness of God with one of our Uber drivers, because he was a very devout Christian who loved the Lord, and was trying to just share the gospel with the people that he was taking in his rides, and that was so cool. We thought it was awesome, and we just ended up worshiping with him in the car as we drove back, and that was amazing.
So I'll just follow up Isaiah, and I'll start with a funny story, and then I'll talk about a success story. One of the days that we're there, it was probably like week 5 or week 6. It was towards the end. We all went like kind of to the outskirts of the city, in this more like secluded, isolated place for like a time of debrief with the team. And we spent the night over in a little like area. There was like a bunch of trees and mountain-ish part. And as we were there, a protest happened. Like in the middle of the city, like a protest broke down, and it was like about like 1 million plus people on the streets. It was rough. Like it was not like hey, we're just protesting, Kiki, walk out. You know, it was like, hey, we're protesting, we're mad. And we're outside of the city, and our hosts, they were like, hey, you cannot go back to where you're staying. We're going to have to figure out a place for you to stay. So luckily, there was this missionary family that was staying like kind of like in the area where we were. They were removed from the city as well, and they're like maybe 5 minutes away. And so they came and picked us up, and they're like, hey, you guys are just going to come to our house and stay here while this massive protest is happening. And so I say funny, but it was just like a very enduring memory that I have, because while this massive protest is happening, people are burning tires and putting like holes into like the middle of the road and all that. We're with this missionary family in their house, and they welcomed all 4 boys to their place, and they had their kids, and so they put like a kids movie, and we're all watching like Iron Giant while in the couch. Riley's taking a nap. Randall is playing with the kids. we were all eating popcorn by the fireplace, and it was just like a really sweet moment. But it kind of made no sense because I was like, man, there's like a massive protest happening that we could all die, and here we are. And so it was a sweet time, and just like looking back, it was very enduring, and we ended up spending the night over their houses, and it was just complete unplanned, and it was like, hey guys, let's be flexible. But I think like the biggest success story, first, like the definition of success like cannot be the worldly definition of success. We have to define success by like what the Lord views as success, and I think like we all agree that success is faithfulness and being faithful to what the Lord is calling you. It's not going to be the results. It's not going to be what you're going to see or do, but it's just being faithful to the Lord. And as we talked, like we did have a really hard time. And my biggest success story is that I fail in a lot of things while we're there. Like technically I was in charge of leading the team, which I didn't do an awesome job, which Isaiah and Riley, they may say I did, but they probably will say I didn't. And I recognize that. Like I recognize like, man, there was things that I could definitely done differently, and I fail in a lot of things, and I'm really thankful I did. And like through that time of like pruning, it was really, really hard. But if anything, I think it goes back to like Paul, right? Like I boast in my weakness. And so like the biggest success story of that trip, it was not like, you know, hey, we're overseas. It's great. It's going to be fun. And all these things are going to happen. Like we did have a lot of fun, and there was a lot of beauty, and we've seen the Lord move mightily, mightily, mightily. But it was hard. And I think that's part of things that not a whole lot of people say whenever they talk about the mission trip. Whenever they get back, everybody wants to hear about their stories and about the success, quote unquote, right? But it's like, how are you faithful in this? How did your faithfulness look like whenever it was hard? Like, what did you learn through your failures? And so I think, without giving anything specific, but just saying like, man, I think my biggest success story of that trip that I can remember was just like failing miserably and having to learn from that and going back to the Lord and being like, Lord, I trust that you moved through my failures and that I still feel 100% called to do this again. And like, if you were to ask me today, like, hey, would you do it again? I would be like, yeah, sign me up.
I think, Pedro, what you talk about though is like learning from failure as being a success point. I think that I really appreciate that because like if you are called to missions overseas for a long period of time, for a lifehood or for a lifetime, or even being on missions here, like there's so much that we're going to learn. I think that we oftentimes, and Anna, you kind of talked about this, about preconceived ideas about the mission field before you go over. We think of ourselves as perfect and not like we need to learn things. And so every time you're going overseas, every time you're on mission in your community even, every time you share the gospel, there are opportunities that the Lord is going to show you to learn and perfect your craft of being a missionary where you are overseas or whatever. So I think it's really nice to highlight the sinfulness of man, first of all, but then also the grace of God to teach us through these moments. And so I think it's awesome to hear the stories of success and success in communication, failures in communication, success in learning, so that like for those people who are planning on going overseas, who are planning on going on long-term missions, they know like, hey, like the work is hard. There's a lot you have to learn, but it's for the glory of the Lord at the end of the day. And so we get to share a part in this, and we get to learn from the Lord how to do his work better, which is one of the most, I think, joyful things that we can do and imagine is that like, oh, he would use me to share the gospel with people in Japan and Africa, even though like I'm sinful, even though I have all these mistakes behind me, in front of me or whatever, the Lord still wants to use me, and he rejoices at using me is one of the most beautiful things that I think y'all embody and that these people and these students can embody when they go on mission. And so I really do appreciate y'all for just being open and frank about your time overseas. to kind of wrap everything up, I really want to see, like, if you could go back right now and grab yourself right before you step on that plane to go to Japan or Kenya and give yourself one piece of advice before you go, what would it be?
Honestly, really similar to what you were just saying, with the Lord, like, teaching us while we're on mission. I read through the book of Luke while I was in Japan, and I remember it was really cool because I read through the book of Luke before, but being in a different context, being on mission, I was able to just, like, the Lord just, like, pulled different parts out of the book. In one part, it's right after Jesus feeds the 5,000, and it's this huge miracle that he does, and he's using his disciples to serve 5,000 people, and they're all experiencing just gifts from the Lord. They're experiencing miracles. They're experiencing the power of God, and all these people see it. And then right after that, he asks them who the people say that he is, and one of his disciples says, well, some of the people say that you're a prophet. Some of them say you're Elijah. Obviously, like, the people didn't understand who Jesus was. And then he turns to them and he says, well, who do you say that I am? And they go, well, like, you are Christ, like, you are the Son of God. And so in this moment, I was reading it and I was like, oh, okay, so Jesus is using the disciples. They're serving the people. The people still have an incomplete understanding of who Jesus is. Obviously, that's so sad, but that's how it was. But then the disciples, the people who Jesus is using, leave this experience with a greater understanding of who he is. And so that was, like, my experience in Japan in a nutshell. Like, I was there for 6 weeks. The people who I was serving still have an incomplete understanding of who Jesus is. Lord willing, I will see them in heaven someday. And we'll be able to rejoice in our salvation together there. But I left Japan not knowing if any of them will ultimately be in heaven with me. But I definitely left with a greater understanding of who Jesus was. Like, being in a different cultural context on the complete other side of the world, I was able to see that, like, God is working there. God is moving there. He is not just, like, powerful in my life. He is not just powerful where I am. He's not just powerful when I'm watching him. Like, he is moving even when I'm not seeing it. And, like, obviously, like, okay, duh. Like, literally, he's the God of the universe. He created everything. But I think sometimes we can get just so wrapped up in, like, what we're experiencing. We can just become so selfish and so wrapped up in what we're doing that we forget how powerful God is. And so I didn't expect to like, silly, but I didn't expect to have such a large picture of who God is. But I did. And so I don't know if that's necessarily advice, but that's definitely a takeaway. And so if you go on mission, I guess my advice is, like, don't become discouraged if your expectations aren't met, if people don't become Christians. Some advice for people who are receiving missionaries coming back, like, don't ask them don't ask them how many people became Christians. Like, it was actually while I was there, another missionary asked me, we were having dinner, and he was like, have you had any salvations yet? And, like, that question genuinely angered me because it was coming from another missionary. And I was like, that is not what this is about. Like, obviously I want people to come to know Jesus. But if you're asking me that question in that way, to me, you're communicating that, like, you only care about the numbers. Whereas, like, I have built relationships. I've seen the Lord move. Like, ask missionaries how they've seen the Lord move, because they're going to have 100 stories. And just because, like, they, quote unquote, haven't seen the numbers doesn't mean that the Lord isn't moving, doesn't mean that the Lord isn't using them. And so, yeah.
For me, I have two pieces of advice. First one is fully trust in the Lord. And that means your typical church answers, reading your Bible. If you are not in Scripture daily before you go, you will not succeed. You won't make it. I'm sorry, you won't. If you're not praying every day, if you're not in constant communication with our Creator, you're going to have a rough time overseas. Memorizing Scripture is also very, very good. The organization that sent us, they gave us a couple scriptures to memorize, and they come up very frequently in my life, even afterwards. The best one I could give is Matthew 6:33 and 34. Oh my goodness, why did I blank on it? 6:34 says, "Do not be anxious about anything. Do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow has enough troubles of its own." And so, like, we need to trust in the Lord with everything we do. Second piece of advice I would give is be okay with being uncomfortable. Being overseas is difficult. Being overseas can be awkward at times. You are walking up to someone and building a relationship with them and sharing with hopes of sharing the gospel with them. You are sharing the gospel with people that probably don't want to hear it. You're hearing different belief systems. You're trying new foods. You're smelling new smells. You're being hit on by random people because they think you have money. Like, you need to be okay with being uncomfortable in your situation and in your life. And that starts here in the United States. It starts with going and sharing the gospel. It starts with going and being intentional with building relationships, being discipling others. If you're not making these foundational steps to build yourself up as a Christian and as a disciple maker, you will struggle while you are overseas on your trip.
A piece of advice that I would say and give as like you guys are going and as you go through kind of training, and not only training, but as you're there, if you see something or if you see something within a person or see something within yourself, say it. Like, no matter what it is, like it is so much better to over communicate than to under communicate, because I don't want you guys to go through the same thing that we went through, and feel the same things we did at times, because it was so hard. It was so hard at times. And it is so much better to over communicate things that you're feeling and things that you see than to under communicate, because there's nothing that's bad that can come from that. And that's my one piece of advice is just to communicate things and to do that well and to ask questions how to do that before you go, to people you trust and leaders in your life, how to communicate well. So that's my one piece of advice.
For me, I think I would just look and say, like Pedro, like, missions is not a department of the church. Missions is not a program of the church, but it's like one of the fundamental characteristics of who God is. He is a missional God and has been doing missions. And it's not us doing our missions, it's us joining him in his mission. And just, I think, trying to understand that through scriptures is probably one of the biggest pieces of advice that I would give to somebody. Because, and my intent here is not like, hey, I would love for everybody to go overseas. I think that's like great experience is going to like change your life. You're going to see the world through different lenses. You're going to get, like Anna said, to have a different perspective on who Christ is from a different cultural lens. But ultimately, like, you need to be where God has you, where placed. And so for us, like, I know one of the missionaries was in charge of us. She one day, after perceiving that a lot of people were like, oh, is being overseas my call? I feel guilty for being in America. She came to us and she just like cried her heart. She came to us and she cried her heart out. And it was like, guys, like I said earlier, it's not you being overseas that's going to make you a missionary. You can be overseas and be disobedient to the Lord because the Lord doesn't want you to be there. Or you can be in America and say, like, well, people need Jesus in America too, which is true, but you're being disobedient because the Lord wants you overseas. And so no matter where it is, you just need to be extremely obedient to the Lord. If it is on a college campus, like, be all there, be present. Like, if you truly think the Lord has you at UCO or at whatever university you're going to or in whatever stage of life you're going to, be fully there. If you think that's where the Lord has you, be fully there. And if you think you're called, like, somewhere else, either, like, across the country or across the ocean, like, man, you need to be obedient to what he has for you. And so, like, to anybody who's going or thinking about going, I would just say, like, just be obedient. And if it is like, hey, you can go for a summer, doesn't mean that you're going to be a lifetime overseas and stuff. But just be obedient to what he has for you.
Well, guys, thank you so much for doing this and spending your time giving advice to other college students about what it's like to go serve overseas. And for all y'all who are listening or watching this, look, UCO BCM as a whole has a heart to send you overseas, to send you on mission even in America. And so if you have other questions that maybe didn't get answered, feel free to come up to one of us on staff or one of these 4 people who have served overseas and be willing to get coffee with them and ask them questions about the reality of serving overseas, because we can't cover everything in this video. But at the end, once again, thank you guys, and thank y'all for tuning in.
Thanks for hanging out with us. Be sure to tune in next week where we'll be having another awesome discussion. And if you want more information or want to ask us a question, make sure to follow us on Instagram at UCO BCM.